порой, что солдаты с кровавых не пришедшие полей не в землю нашу полегли когда-то, а превратились в белых журавлей. Они до сей поры с времен тех дальних летят и подают нам голоса. Не потому ль так часто и печально мы замолкаем, глядя в небеса. Летит по небу клин усталый, летит в тумане на исходе дня, и в том строю есть промежуток малый. Быть может, это место для меня. Настанет день из журавлиной стаи. Я поплыву в такой же сизой мгле. Из-под небес по птичьи окликая всех вас, кого оставил на земле. Солдаты с кровавых не пришедшие полей не в землю нашу полегли когда-то, а превратились в белых журавлей.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am here with the wonderful good friend of the show, Scott Ritter. Scott, how are you today?
Well, I was doing okay till you played that song.
Yeah. Just so our listeners know, that song and the cranes are being kind of utilized as the symbols of this the massacre that occurred over the weekend. That's what we're here to talk about today. While we kind of get ourselves together, we're going to play a recap for you guys. It's just 3 minutes, so you guys are caught up with all the events of the attack up to today, and then we'll get started. uptick these terrorist attacks. Now we have another one in Moscow. I don't know if you see the breaking news.
No, I haven't.
Crocus City Hall, the music venue in Moscow. There's been a shooting. 3 people in camouflage opened fire. There are wounded, according to RIA. And our listeners are now saying that there is a fire in the building.
Как? За что задержан, знаешь? Оружие где? Где оружие, бля? Удила, бля!
Что делал в Крокусе?
Застрелить.
Что? Застрелил?
Да.
Кого?
Почему указание?
Людей.
Зачем? Поставьте, пожалуйста.
Все 4 непосредственных исполнителей теракта, все те, кто стрелял, убивал людей, найдены и задержаны. Они пытались скрыться и двигались в сторону Украины. США по разным каналам пытаются убедить своих сателлитов и другие страны мира в том, что по их разведданным киевского следа в московском теракте якобы нет. Что кровавый теракт совершили последователи ислама, члены запрещенной в России организации ИГИЛ. Мы знаем, чьими руками было совершено это злодеяние против России и ее народа. Нас интересует, кто заказчик.
Vladimir Putin is already trying to link this to Ukraine and say that Ukraine is responsible. Does the U.S. have any evidence to back that up?
No, there is no whatsoever any evidence. And in fact, what we know to be the case is that ISIS-K is actually, by all accounts, responsible for what happened.
Mr. Putin's going to get some nice surprises.
With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the east, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield.
Вы назвали США, Британию и Украину. Вот 3 страны, которые остаются
Во всяком случае, мы сейчас говорим о той фактуре, которой мы располагаем. Это общая, так сказать, информация, но если уже направление на работу.
Из Украины.
Из Украины.
So Scott, you just came back recently from a really emotional and cathartic trip from Russia. What are your thoughts over the attack over the weekend?
Well, first of all, let's explain that song a little bit more. It was written by a Dagestani poet after he visited Hiroshima, and he met a young Japanese girl who had created a paper, the origami cranes, white cranes, and so he wrote a poem that linked the visual of cranes to victims, the innocent victims of war, but to all victims. And the poem began because it's a poem that resonates with people with a military background, because he talks about the soldiers that didn't return from the battlefield, and he says sometimes he envisions them as cranes flying home. So in Russia, this song, I think, resonates deeply because it brings the victims to life. They just aren't forgotten people. They're there with you. And that's one of the things I learned in traveling to Russia the last time, is just how much history and the painful history of Russia resonates with the Russian people. We talk about the Russian soul. In America, I keep trying to explain it to people. I say, oh, the Russian soul. I'm on a search of the Russian soul, and they're like rolling their eyes, going, "What the hell is he off talking again about the Russian soul?" Because we don't have that shared history of suffering that the Russians do. Because the Russian soul, it's a wonderful thing, but it's something that is grounded in a millennium of suffering, of pain, and especially World War II. I was struck by how every Russian I met talked about looking up at the stars at night, and they don't see stars. They see the eyes of their relatives staring down at them, holding them accountable for what was done in their name. And so I think it's important to talk about that because you can get caught up in the superficiality of Russia just like anywhere else. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that mean, but it's a beautiful place. I mean, you get off, you get into Moscow. It's a beautiful city, and you're struck by how clean it is, how modern it is. And when I say superficial, I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just saying that you're looking at that as sort of the way Americans would look at it. We're driven by wealth, and we're driven by beauty, and we're driven by things. So you go to Moscow and you're going, man, what a beautiful city. And then you see the Russian people, and I mean, they're beautiful people, but I have to tell you, they ain't easy to crack into. They walk down the street in America. I mean, I notice about it because Russians make fun of me all the time. I'm just walking around going, "Hey, how you doing?" Like, why are you asking me how I'm doing? I don't know. How you doing? Do you really want to know? I think so. But I'm just sort of throwing it away. How you doing? It's supposed to be, good. How you doing? I'm doing great. Then you move on. But the Russians like, you asked me a serious question. How am I doing? So let me sit down and tell you how I'm doing. And they open their soul, and you're like, I didn't want that. That's not what I meant. But then actually, it should have been exactly what you meant. Because the Russians, unless you're willing to do that, unless you're willing to sit down and say, here I am, this is who I am, then they don't have time for you. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's just like, okay, I'm going to get on with the business because so don't ask a Russian how they're doing unless you really want to know how they're doing, because that's the way the Russians are. They're very stoic. They're very staid. You look at them and you can be intimidated by them easily. But once you get to know them, once you sit down and you talk to them and they open up, what a wonderful people. Just like America. I mean, Americans are wonderful. We're wonderful right here. Hey, how you doing? I'm doing good. Hey, what's up, man? And we're sincere about it. I'm not saying we're insincere. We approach it differently because we don't have, for the most part, 1,000 years of suffering weighing down on us. We don't have 27 million relatives killed just 80 years ago in a horrific war. We don't have a history of the world colluding against us. This isn't the first time that Russia's been surrounded by enemies. It's happened before and again and again and again. And so forgive the Russian people if they take these millennia of sorrow and pain and suffering and they bottle it up inside and they say, I don't want to share it with you because I don't trust you enough to share this with you. But once you sit down and you know them, they say, okay, here I am. And you find out that through this suffering is not just pain, but joy, happiness, that they know the difference between, good and bad, and they know how to enjoy life. Man, Russians live like you've never seen Russians live life. They're pretty cool. So, that's what I took away from the trip, the complexity of Russia. There's nothing simple about Russia. I hear the Russians are a simple people. Oh, no, they're not. Ain't nothing simple about a Russian. And they're a complex people, and sometimes so complex that it's truly hard to understand where they're coming from and why they do the things they do. And I think right now, in America, we take a look at this terrorist attack that just took place at the Crocus City Hall and a concert venue. In the American, I mean, I remember 9/11. I remember the morning of 9/11 when it happened, and I remember how my country behaved afterwards. Insanity, just straight up insanity. Seeking to blame somebody, wrapping ourselves in the flag of patriotism. USA, you're either with us or against us. We're going to declare war on the world. Let's march. Let's do it. And then I'm looking at the Russian reaction, and again, it's stayed. it's more quiet. And some people might misunderstand that. But I think if you've seen some things, you'll know that the Russians take this very seriously. Look, I'm not a proponent of torture. I've condemned the United States for torture. I'm a Marine trained in interrogation, and I have the personal belief, based upon professional experience, that torture doesn't achieve the results that you want it to achieve. Also, as an American, I just believe that it's fundamentally wrong. So I'm not going to sit here and condone what the Russians have done to these prisoners. But what I will say is that if you had to push the Russians pretty hard to get them to that point, that they aren't a people that's the first inclination. You had to push them pretty hard to get to the point where they're doing things of this nature. And so people need to understand the seriousness to which Russia attaches this attack and what the consequences of this will be. I'm sure we're going to talk about it, so I'll hold off and wait for questions to respond. But the notion that this is just another terrorist attack is absurd in the extreme. This is an act of war against Russia.
Yeah, I keep trying to stress that to Americans about how I could put this into context for an American, because we have mass shootings every weekend. So for us, this is like a once every 2 or 3 months occurrence. I'm telling people, Americans, this is pretty much a 9/11 for Russia. That's how severe it is. I mean, this is the worst attack on Russian soil since Breslin, which was in 2004, I believe, killing 103, I think. So actually, this is worse than Breslin. But I want to get your opinion on at least the events leading up to the attack. So we had a warning from the United States, and then shortly after that, Russia thwarted one or two attacks. Is that true? And
according to the news, according to TASS, the Russian FSB did stop some ISIS attacks on, which I just want to point out right off the bat. That means Russia knows ISIS. Please understand that ISIS is not a foreign concept to them, that the Russians are fully aware of who ISIS is and what ISIS is and what ISIS does. So when Russia says that ain't ISIS, it's not based upon a lack of a fundamental misunderstanding of what ISIS is. No, Russia knows ISIS. They've been dealing with ISIS. They've thwarted ISIS.
Not only have they been dealing with it, they're actually renowned for understanding how to deal with, especially Central Asian extremism. So yeah, that's another thing that I kind of pointed out, is that they're familiar with ISIS. So, but we'll get to that. So then we have Victoria Nuland. She didn't say that once, but she said that twice about Putin getting surprises and asymmetrical warfare. Now, when she said asymmetrical warfare, I mean, I took that kind of, like, she could have meant that the Ukrainians are already the underdogs, but I took it to mean kind of like this. So what was your interpretation of Nuland's words? So this is prior or just after they announced her retirement, and then prior to her retiring. So what are your thoughts?
I think we have to put Nuland's words into context, because when we're going to speak of asymmetrical warfare, I mean, that's sort of a political term. The military term is irregular warfare or unconventional warfare. These are specific skill sets, a specific kind of warfare that involves sabotage. That means blowing things up. It involves assassinations. It involves disrupting elections. That's one of the goals and objectives of unconventional warfare, political disruption. And the entity in the United States that is legally tasked with doing this is the CIA's Special Activities Center. It's authorized under a 1947 law that was furthered in 1948 and continues to be furthered through covert action laws passed in the aftermath of the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s that give the president the ability to sign presidential findings that authorize the CIA to carry out actions like this. So when Victoria Nuland, just the reason why I said that, when Victoria Nuland stands there and says, asymmetrical warfare, and she didn't just say it. I respect warriors. So if you're going to sit there and you're going to stare people in the camera and talk about war and the hardness of war, I may be your enemy. I may be oppose you, but if you're taking it seriously and you're staring at me, I'm like, okay, you take it seriously. Let's hook and jab. Let's do it. She was smiling. She was cackling. So there, she's somebody who really doesn't understand because she doesn't do. She lets other do her dirty work. She's the cookie monster who went to Maidan in 2014 and started a process that led to snipers killing 100 people, snipers of the side that she supported, murdering those people to have this coup d'etat. The CIA has been actively involved inside Ukraine for decades. Since 2014, though, the Special Activities Center, and this is important because they're the only ones that do unconventional warfare, irregular warfare, the asymmetrical stuff that Nuland's talking about. They have been engaged with Ukrainian intelligence services, the GUR, the military intelligence, and the SBU, the intelligence service, to carry out acts inside Russia. They trained the Ukrainians on the skill sets necessary to operate irregular teams deep behind enemy lines. Now, that's what they call them. The Russians would call them terrorist teams because what they're doing is acts of terrorism, acts of violence designed to achieve a political gain. So the CIA Special Activities Ground Branch has been working with the Ukrainians to train them in this skill set, and they have been doing this. There are deep raids taking place inside Russia that are a result of the training by the CIA to these people, both in terms of drone strikes and ground penetrations, teams that have gone inside. The CIA has worked with the Ukrainians to use social media like Telegram, et cetera, to reach out and recruit people who live inside Russia who might be susceptible to recruitment to carry out espionage, sabotage, etc. A lot of trains were blown up in Russia, done by these recruits who are already in Russia, who then are given the training online or through remote training on how to go out and lay down explosives. They're given the explosives, they blow up the explosives. So this has been going on for some time now. I also need to point out that the CIA Special Activities Center is experts at creating, armies of radicals. They're the ones who helped arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They're the ones who created, the Iraqi National Congress in the effort to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They're the ones who created through Sycamore, whatever the operation was in Syria, the Syrian opposition, to include elements of ISIS and Al Qaeda. They created an army out of them, and they've done the same thing in Afghanistan, a secret new army that that was supposed to prop up their government, but it failed. My point is that the Special Activity Center is an expert doing, and they did it in Ukraine. They created, together with Ukrainian intelligence, an army of Russian nationalists who, and here's the important part, have invaded Russia. I just want to point that out. They invaded Russia. 5,000 went across the border into Belgorod. They didn't get very far. They got crushed, beat back, but they physically invaded Russia. The CIA did this. Scott, how do you know the CIA did it? Well, first of all, it's been admitted. Second of all, the U.S. Army is not allowed to train these Russian nationalists. These aren't the Ukrainian army. They don't have the remit. And yet, these Russian nationalists were using U.S. equipment, M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles that they were operating. Where'd they get that training? Ground branch of the CIA's Special Activities Center. So my point is the CIA, up until early March, mid-March, was involved in direct action designed to disrupt the election of the Russian president. That's the head of the Russian nationalists and the head of Ukrainian intelligence said, why are these guys going into Belgrade? To disrupt the election. Stated that is a political goal of the CIA's Special Action Center's political action branch. They have branches that do everything. The CIA is everywhere. They do everything. That's why they should be disbanded. That's a different question. My point is, so when we talk about what happened at the Crocus Center, Understand that it was originally designed and to take place on March 9th. An attack there. Why March 9th? Shaman, the well-known Russian pop singer, folk singer, was scheduled and did perform to a packed audience there. And the idea was to attack that, to create havoc, to undermine confidence in Vladimir Putin, to disrupt the election, to make it difficult for Russians to want to go to the polls, to suppress the number of participants, the whole works. That was the goal of the attack. That's a CIA objective, by the way. I think people need to understand that the President of the United States has signed a covert finding authorizing the CIA to use irregular warfare, asymmetric means to disrupt the election. Could you imagine? I mean, we got mad at the Russians for doing, we accused them of hacking in and getting in and leaking information. They didn't do that, by the way, but we accused them of doing it. And we were enraged. What if the Russians were down in Mexico and they decided, what the hell, we're just going to form an army of Mexican Americans working with the cartels, and we're going to send them in October and early November just to kill people, to blow things up, to disrupt the elections. No big deal, right? We'd say, no, that's an act of war.
Yeah.
And okay, so please understand that America has been working with Ukrainians committing acts of war. Again, we know that Ukraine has an issue with Russia right now, derived from the special military operation. And one can say, okay, you want to play adult games? That's happened. Russia sent troops in, Ukraine gets to respond. Fine. But America has no reason to be doing this, no legal reason. But we are at war with Russia. We have created a private army, and we have sent that army onto Russian soil. We have facilitated the creation of an irregular warfare unit, because it's trained in military tactics, sent in to accomplish this political military objective of disruption of elections. This isn't an act of terrorism in terms of ISIS saying we want to blow things up in the name of Allah. This is a directed attack designed to achieve a political result that has been ordered by the United States president in a covert finding to the CIA to achieve this. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be really careful about the direction that we're heading down right now, because the Russians have every right to say, you're declaring war on us, you're committing acts of war against us. And I think we should understand that the head of the Russian FSB, Britnikov, I think his last name is Alexander Britnikov, when asked about, well, what are you going to do about it? He said, everything is ahead of us. And that should chill your blood, because that means that there will be retribution. And Medvedev has made it clear that it doesn't matter what your nationality is, what government you are. If you were involved in this action, there will be retribution. This isn't a game. This isn't Victoria Nuland. She's sitting there pretending this is a game. She thinks this is another Cookie Monster event. She's cackling about, surprises. Hey, Vicky, your name's on the list too. I mean, I'm not encouraging Russians to come after Americans, but you what's that old thing? Fool around, find out.
I don't think the first F is fool, but fool around and find out. But yeah, like what people don't know is that the CIA has fostered a great relationship with Ukrainian insurgents since 1948. They've been there. So, I mean, this isn't far out of the realm of possibility. So the attack occurs. I watched the videos. Now, I'm not a sharpshooter, but they didn't look very well trained to me. They did look like kind of, and so when they said ISIS-K was responsible, I was like, well, they don't really act or shoot like ISIS militants. Now, I read a post by Elijah Magnier, who has worked and studied ISIS cells since their fruition, and he said the same thing. He said they don't look like ISIS, they don't behave like ISIS, they don't talk like ISIS. What can you tell us about what is it, ISKP, the ISIS-K or whatever it is?
Well, Islamic State Khorasan was created in I think 2014, around there. It is affiliated in terms of their desire for a caliphate. I mean, if you take a look at what differentiates ISIS from Al-Qaeda is about Islamic resistance against the the Americans for the crime of coming into Saudi Arabia and corrupting the two holy sites, Mecca and Medina. But it was never about the creation of a Islamic caliphate. ISIS is derived from people who said Al Qaeda is not doing enough, that we have to expand this struggle. So I think it's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Went off from what was Al Qaeda Iraq, AQI, went to Syria and started forming the Islamic State. And so they created a caliphate. They carved out a chunk of territory, 30% of Syria, 40% of Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. And their actions motivated militants operating in Afghanistan, both in terms of Taliban, Pashtun, Afghan Pashtun, but also in many cases, more importantly, Uzbeks, who were part of the Uzbek Islamic resistance force that were fighting with the Taliban as part of a larger Al Qaeda movement. And they said, we want some of that caliphate stuff too. We like that. That's more hardcore. The Al Qaeda and Taliban are talking about negotiating an end to the solution. We don't want to negotiate it. We want to create a caliphate. And so they broke away from the Taliban ranks and they created the Islamic State Khorasan. Khorasan is the historic name for this region, that encompasses Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, etc. So that was it. These are hardcore Islamists, and they have good military training, and they oftentimes they believe in martyrdom. And here's the important thing. In the Islamic State allows people to self-identify as Islamic State in carrying out their acts. And the way to do that is you have the Islamic State flag, and then you do a video where you recite the Shahada, I believe it is. Again, I'm not an expert, but the Shahada, which is the Islamic creed. It's one of the most important creeds. It's basically there is no God, but God and Allah is, or Muhammad is his prophet, something of that nature. And it's an act. It's words that say, "I am a pious Muslim." Pious is important. Now, if you study the various sunnah and things of that nature, there is no requirement other than to say those words, but you have to mean those words. But the Islamists, Bin Laden and al-Baghdadi, they are famous or infamous for when they recite it to raise their right hand, and they recite it pointing the finger. And so this has become the Shahada finger. And so you often see these fundamentalists, before they go off and martyr themselves, make a video where they recite this, the flag's there, and they're saying, "I am now ISIS." And then ISIS will receive that video, look at the attack and say, okay, we accept you. And then they will publish this on their media website. And that's an important distinction, because if ISIS is the originator of the idea where it's hardcore ISIS to go out and attack, ISIS releases that attack using ISIS Central, their headquarters. So in this case, there was a photograph taken of these four perpetrators, these terrorists, who are giving Shahada with their left hand.
Yeah,
Now, in Islam, the left hand is, we Christians can laugh about it, but it's a serious thing.
Oh.
This is the hand of Satan.
Yeah.
This is the hand of good. This is the hand of righteousness. This is the hand of evil. This is the hand of Satan. So right off the bat, you can't call them pious because they've given Shahada with their left hand. And two, they blurred their faces. Since when do martyrs blur their faces? Because they ain't martyrs. They never intended to die. These aren't believers. These are mercenaries. They were paid to carry out an unconventional warfare act inside Moscow by somebody. But it wasn't ISIS. This wasn't ISIS planned. ISIS was a cover story. The cover story of ISIS was built in. And what's important about this is that on March 7th, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow released a statement.
Mhm.
It was very specific, very specific. It said that there will be an act by extremists of terrorism. They will attack public gathering venues to include concert halls within the next 24 to 48 hours. It was issued the same day that this cell operating in Moscow sent one of their operatives to the Crocus City Hall and concert venue to do a reconnaissance. He came back because they were planning on attacking it on March 9th, 48 hours after the March 7th event, to when Shaman was going to be performing there. He came back and said, security's too tight, guys. We can't do it. So they went into sleeper mode and they waited till, but how did the US know this? Was it guesswork? How did they know that there was going to be extremists within 48 hours attacking a concert venue? Because the CIA is in cahoots with the Ukrainians that were planning this. The United States has a duty and a responsibility, a duty to report when they get information about, an impending attack. And so, even though we don't have good relations with Russia, we're supposed to tell them. But the way to inform Russia, Anatoly Antonov, the Russian ambassador, just came out with a statement. He said, "I'm here. I'm the Russian ambassador. Why didn't anybody call me? Why didn't somebody come to me and say, here's what we got? I got all the right guys here. I got my intelligence dude. I got my security dude. We have secure communications back to Moscow. Come and brief me. I'll get it to you." Or in Moscow, you have a U.S. ambassador who could have gone and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, Mr. Head of Intelligence, I've got very sensitive information about an impending attack." That's not how it was done. It was done through unofficial means. Now, we don't know exactly how that was done, but it means that the Russians receiving it didn't come through official channels, because normally you have official channels. I just interviewed a guy, a Russian FSB guy, who was the man who delivered the information package to the United States, warning them about the Tsarnaev brothers in the lead up to the Boston bombing. This meant that Russia put an FSB guy on an airplane who flew to the United States and met with the CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, and said, "This is what we have on the Tsarnaev brothers. We think they're getting ready to do something. We want to give you a heads up." Of course, we ignored it, and the Boston bombing took place. And he was actually in the United States when that happened. And so they called him back in to talk it over. But that's called official contacts. As we proved through the Boston bombing, it doesn't always work if the other side doesn't want to listen. But could you imagine what it'd be like if, instead of sending this guy over with this package, some FSB guy went to Vienna, to a well-known restaurant in Vienna where CIA people like to hang out because they're so damn secretive that they never do anything that's predictable. And so this restaurant that I won't name, but everybody knows where it is, the FSB goes there and he brushes up against a guy and he says, "Hey, buy you a beer." Some stuff's about to go down, man. I mean, in Moscow, we got some information. Stuff's going to go down. It's going to be bad. It's going to happen in the next 24 or 48 hours. You guys might want to be thinking about it. So now I'm the CIA guy's going, well, what do I do with this? It's not done officially. The official way is for that guy to come in and hand the package. Now the guy's coming to me. Is he trying to set us on a false path? Is this a provocation? What's going on? So forgive the Russians if they receive this brush off by a CIA person of unofficial nature. If they went, what the hell is America trying to do here? Provoke us? Get us to do something? What's going on? We'll look at it, but it's not the same as you handing a package over. But in retrospect, what it was is part of the cover story, because what it allowed the United States to do immediately is say, interestingly enough, and I love Maria Zakharova. I think she's awesome. And one of the things I really like about her is y'all couldn't solve the Kennedy assassination until now. You haven't told us exactly who did Nord Stream 2, and yet within immediately, that Ukraine didn't do it and ISIS-K did do it.
Right.
Sure that. But I think that this was part of the cover story, part of the effort to deliberately guide the Russians away from Ukraine, because we know the truth. We know that Ukraine was involved, and we also know that we were involved. Peripherally or directly, that has yet to be determined. But the evidence is in the embassy statement. We had evidence that this attack was taking place.
Well,
very specific evidence, by the way.
oh yeah, absolutely. Well, what do you think about so they're captured. They're all Tajiks. I also want to remind our listeners, and you probably remember, but January, I want to say 4th, but so in January, that's when the terror attack occurred at the General Soleimani memorial in Iran. And that was claimed by ISIS-K pretty immediately as well. And Iran came out and said, we know ISIS-K. We have eradicated ISIS-K. The remnants that are still left over are just mercenaries that work for the West. So this has Israel and the United States on it. And now we have this in Russia, and immediately they try to prescribe it to ISIS-K. Then they catch Tajiks, which, for a Westerner, they don't know anything about Central Asia. But for our listeners, Tajiks aren't really that religious. One, they're a nomadic peoples. Two, they aren't Turks. They're actually Iranian, they're Persians, and they're kind of like the misfits of Central Asia, the former Soviet republics, and they're very, very poor and destitute. And that's why when he said 10,000 or 10 million ruble, I was like, oh yeah, these are just kind of disenfranchised. And so for me, and I keep trying to stress this, try to get away from these American suggestions that this is Muslim extremism. It was just a financial transaction. It's a business transaction to them. If they were ISIS, I'm sure they would have gone down with the ship, honestly.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Tajiks, I mean, you're right. They're a Persian people. They speak a derivative of Farsi. They're primarily Shia, although not exclusively. When you get into the mountains of Garm and the region around the border with Afghanistan, you get Tajiks who are Sunni Sufists. But the interesting thing about Sufism is it's not a form of Islam that's conducive to the embracement of Wahhabism or Salafism, the extreme ideology that governs organizations like Al Qaeda and ISIS. So the Tajiks aren't necessarily your best recruits. I will say this: the Tajiks had a civil war in the 1990s. Again, that was religious based, and that civil war led to a certain radicalization amongst a segment of the Sunni population who believed that they had been abandoned by their the leaders of their faith, etc., and they took common cause with sort of the Salafism and Wahhabism. And so to say that the Tajiks couldn't ever be infected by the Salafism or Wahhabism is wrong, but it's a distinct minority, and they stand out. The interesting thing about communities like the Tajik community is that they're very tightly knit. We see that we see that this group that carried out this act insinuated itself into a network of Tajiks who are in Moscow. They were able to rent an apartment from a Tajik. I guess the guy they rented from was a Kyrgyz, but a Central Asian. They got the car from a Tajik family. And I think you're going to find out that they got money, they got food, they did everything to keep their profile low while they're waiting for an opportunity to attack the Crocus City College. Remember, they're supposed to carry out the attack on the 9th. It didn't happen until the 22nd. So what happened in between? They have to lay low. Somebody has to support that. You have to do it in a way that doesn't raise the profile, and you do that by insinuating yourself into this immigrant population, which is susceptible to, because of you, as you mentioned, poverty issues. It can be exploited, and we have both the CIA and the Ukrainian intelligence services reaching out. There are communities, Telegram communities, and beginning negotiations and discussions that way. The CIA has admitted this. I mean, how stupid can they be? But you remember when the director of operations of the CIA came out and said, "We're looking for a few good Russians." He did a video. "We're looking for some Russians, and we're going to reach out to you, and you can contact us on Telegram, because Telegram's got great point-to-point, encryption." But they do the same thing with these religious groups. I was speaking to somebody who said that ISIS dropped using social media as a recruitment vehicle sometime in the 2017-2019 time period. Primarily, that's when the State Department was creating a counter social media capability, and the U.S. was learning how to infiltrate social media networks, and it was turning out bad for ISIS because people were dying, and so they backed away from that. So if you're somebody though that isn't aware of that, and you're sitting there on your Telegram channel, and somebody pops in and starts talking to you and convinces you that they're, religious and they're this, understand the CIA has teams that come together to do this. I'll just throw this out there. I got under a lot of criticism from people who took umbrage at what I was when I condemned what I thought that what I believe that Gonzalo Lira was doing in this post-arrest phase, creating these this forum where people could come in and talk and they'd exchange ideas, and then you got this circle of people communicating both online and offline. And I have correctly said that that is a way, and we know that the British and the Americans use and the Ukrainians use this to collect patterns of behavior, to collect patterns of life, online life, so that they could mirror image that, so that they could become that convincingly. The CIA and other intelligence services have done the same thing with Islamist groups online. The CIA is fully capable of creating a team that can become an imam or become the assistant of an imam, because they have participated in this. They have absorbed the data. They know how to say the right things. They know how approaches work because they've watched it happen. And so they pattern their response on that, so it becomes very believable. And so when these poor Tajiks start communicating with somebody, it's not like, if somebody came in and tried to tell me they played football for Franklin and Marshall in the early 1980s, I'd be able to call BS, because I played football for Franklin and Marshall in the 1980s, and I'd be able to throw out things, and I'd say you're not saying it right. Or if they said, "No, I was in the Marine Corps." Really? I mean, I've done this a lot of times. I've had people come into my Telegram channel and start talking about their fantastic special operations background, and I'm like, that ain't how they talk. That ain't, what the data you're putting out there isn't how it's described. BS. And so if you're a Muslim and you're sitting there and you have your community and somebody comes in, you'll be able to call, you'll be able to say, this is fake. But the CIA, because of the social experiments, such as the ones run by Gonzalo Lira on behalf of the Ukrainian intelligence service, very valuable intelligence collection tool, by the way, that social experiment has enabled them to come up with believable profiles to infiltrate. And so these people were recruited by remote, by somebody who was convincing online and convinced them to go down a path. But it's all a CIA controlled or Ukrainian intelligence controlled, same thing, operation. It's not ISIS-K. This has nothing to do with ISIS-K. And it's not about weapons handling. It's just about the whole profile. This was a mercenary attack. These were people who were recruited for money, not ideology. They decided to do it because they wanted to make money. Now, that doesn't mean that ISIS-K is incapable of doing recruitment for money. We know they went to Libya and recruited people, and there was a paycheck attached. But this particular event is a mercenary event. It's not an event derived from a sense of a wronged individual who wants to go out and do something. That's total fake nonsense. This was a mercenary event where the United States then helped Ukraine craft a cover story that was, and we see how quickly the U.S. put the cover story in place. Boom, Crocus. It's ISIS. It's not Ukraine. Really?
What did you think about the recent news that came out that the guy, I think one of the guys said he trained in northern Syria, and the other guy, or maybe it was the same guy, had pictures from a vacation in Turkey. What did you think about that? Is that, do you think, so I've kind of been tinfoil hatting this sort of pipeline of weapons and sort of mercenaries and terrorists from Turkey to Ukraine and then back to Turkey down into the Levant and into the Sahel. So do you think this is one of those instances? And that's what we're looking at. But again, I didn't see anything that was indicative of them receiving training from anybody at all. But yeah, he did definitely had vacation pictures in Turkey.
Well, The Turks have explained the vacation pictures as this guy is a Moscow resident. In order to recertify his Moscow residency, he had to leave Russia for a couple of days and then return.
That
And
does
so,
happen.
yeah, and so that's the Turks are painting it that way. But it's also an opportunity to meet people and to do things. Again, here's the beauty thing about this. We're early on in investigation, so a lot of what's going on is pure speculation. I'm comfortable with making some speculation because I have an experience in intelligence, and I know how this operated in the past. That's no guarantee that it's operating that way today, but I admit I'm speculating. The Russians, however, here's some things that we know. We know that they gained access to one of the phones early on after the attack. That they got one of I guess somebody saw the person drop a phone. They got in a fist fight with the guy, and the phone was dropped. So the Russians were able to gain access to this phone. And from that phone, they were immediately able to identify phone numbers affiliated with the other perpetrators and to begin to understand the network that's going on. So they, rather than stop the car, because they knew the car they were in, because they can track it and they were able to get it on camera and all this stuff, they followed it. And they're listening to the conversations real time. They're listening to the guys on the phones, calling in and talking to people in Ukraine and saying, we're on our way. And they're coordinating. You need to be here at this time. Work your way down this route. We'll meet you here. It said they're coordinating to create this. The Russians have said there was a reception committee in Ukraine working to open the border for them. How do they know that? They were listening to them talking real time. They're also watching as they're posting videos. And here's the key thing. Where are they posting the videos to? Are these guys communicating directly with ISIS Central, which would you be doing if you were ISIS-K? Or are they posting to an intermediary who then posts it to the media arm of ISIS for evaluation, which is what happened. So the Russians are monitoring this. The Russians know so much more than is being let on. So much that they were able to get the Turks to make a raid in Turkey and arrest 40 people that are part of the support network that's operating. But again, the fact that you have a support network doesn't mean that it's ISIS-K. It just means, I give away tools of the trade here. If I'm running an operation, I am going to, and I want to remember it's a covert operation, which means it's deniable. I am not going to set up something in Turkey that says I'm the CIA or I'm Ukrainian intelligence. I'm going to set up an entity, a cover story that actually functions in the way it's supposed to, and the people in there may believe that they're actually working for ISIS. I may have fooled them into saying you're working for ISIS, or I may have pulled people who worked for ISIS before and come back to them and say, hey, we need to operate you. We need to bring you into operation again. Oh, another ISIS operation? Yeah. Who's in charge? Well, Imam Scott. Never heard of him, but he's a new guy in town. Imam Scott's a good guy. You got to listen to him. Oh, okay, we'll work for Imam Scott. So they're doing their thing. So the fact that these 40 guys in Turkey may or may not have thought that they were really ISIS-K is irrelevant. If I'm setting up a covert operation, I need to have everything be deniable, everything. And so now people say, well, Scott, if they're that good, how come they did the phone? You guys do know that in 2003, the CIA went to Italy and kidnapped an Egyptian cleric and took him off to Guantanamo and had him tortured. He was innocent. He wasn't guilty of anything. But how do we know this? Because the CIA made a mistake. They used their phones. And then they didn't get rid of the phones. They kept their phones, used the same phones. They didn't use burner phones. And the Italians went in and got a whiff of this and were able to trace it to cell phone towers. And suddenly they have the entire communication network by name of every CIA covert operative involved in this. And they issued arrest warrants. The CIA isn't perfect. They make mistakes. And the people they train make mistakes. When you're under pressure, when things, it's one thing to be trained in something. I would have hoped they were trained in the art of burner phones. But you just went into the Crocus Center. You just murdered people. and you've left, and maybe you weren't even expecting to get out, but you're like, holy cow, we got out. We're driving away. Where's the burner phone? Oh, I might have left it in the parking lot. We'll just use our phones anyways. And so they use their phones and they get traced. Mistakes are made all the time in this business. And that's, the Russians were able to exploit the mistakes. But it's not just these terrorists who make mistakes. I just pointed out a case where the CIA, the best of the best, made a huge mistake in Italy that compromised 20 covert operatives by name, to include the chief of station, who had to flee for his life, including an Air Force colonel in Brindisi, who was part of this, who had to flee for his life because he was going to be arrested too, because they were all linked by cell phone records to this kidnapping.
So, and then today we find out that Zelensky fires Danilov. Do you think that that's related at all to the instance in Moscow, and they're not letting that on? Because I don't remember him doing anything that was like to fireable offensive or whatever. But what's that about?
Well, again, here we get into speculation because we don't know exactly what's going on. But there's a lot of talk that even in the lead up to this attack, prior to this attack, that the Bridget, I can't remember, Brink maybe, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Dogs are barking.
Maverick.
I think the CIA is coming to my front door.
No.
But it's FedEx, but you never know. FedEx could be undercover. Gosh, the barking threw me off. We were talking about Danilov. Bridget, the Brinkley, I think her name is Brink or something like that, the U.S. ambassador, had meetings with Zelensky and his intelligence people. And my understanding is that she read them the Riot Act. That one of the things that she got them on was carrying out unauthorized attacks against Russian oil infrastructure. And she said, you have to stop this because, you're doing stuff that's causing prices to increase.
Yes.
We're in an election year and we ain't in the business of dealing with increased oil prices. And I think she also was telling them to rein in things. See, I think what happened is the CIA created a Frankenstein with Budanov, the head of military intelligence, with the gentleman who's the head of their security, and Danilov overseeing this. He's the head of the National Security Committee or Council that oversees this. And they created this Frankenstein monster. The Special Activities Division went in there and trained them on all these skill sets. And many of the skill sets were designed to be used in an occupied zone. So as the Russians push in, the idea was that the Ukrainians would leave stay-behind teams that then would carry out these operations. But the same skill set that involves maintaining covert cells, sustaining, et cetera, can be projected into Russia. And the CIA, I believe, said, we don't do in Russia. We can't get involved in that. It requires a different presidential finding. We have a presidential finding that says you can operate in the occupied territory and maybe even in Crimea, but you certainly can't do it in Russia. And Budanov and Danilov and everybody went, thank you very much, but we don't give a damn. We're going to do whatever the hell we want to do, what we need to do. And you had Budanov bragging about striking deeper and deeper and deeper. And remember the CIA got so mad at them for killing Daria Dugina that the CIA did something unprecedented. They went to the media and said, that ain't us. Yeah. We told them not to do that. That's not us. But it's too bad. It is you, because you trained them in that skill set. The same skill set it takes to infiltrate somebody into Russian occupied territory can be used to infiltrate into Russia. The same concept of building, networks, support networks, etc. It's the same skill set. And what the Ukrainians did is started overlaying that onto Russia. And the United States is saying, we don't like the escalation ladder that is derived from what you're doing, because it directly implicates us. It complicates our life, especially in an election year. You need to cease and desist. And I think Danilov told them to pound sand. And so now I think what's happened is the Americans have come in and said, you guys do understand that you're on your way out and that your only lifeline is us. That's it. and yet we're going to make sure that you die a very painful death because we're done with you. If you continue to do this nonsense, we are finished with you. And I think Danilov basically said, screw you, we're going to do it anyways. And the Americans went to Zelensky and said, you can die tomorrow if you want to, because we'll tell the Russians your protection's off, or you can unscrew this situation. And I think Zelensky fired him. He also, there's a big reshuffling taking place. Danilov was fired. I think the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service was replaced, and I wouldn't be surprised if Budanov and the head of the SBU are shown the door in the not too distant future, because the United States, we're in a very difficult situation right now because we are directly implicated. I don't know if the United States planned the attack that took place in Moscow. Actually, if you want my honest opinion, we didn't plan it because we don't have a presidential finding that allows that. I don't even think we have a presidential finding that allows these Russian nationalists to invade Belgorod. Fact is, I'm confident we don't have a presidential finding that allows that. But they've gone rogue. Budanov has gone rogue. Budanov is doing these attacks in Belgorod, and we're saying, don't do that. You can't do that. That's a level of escalation we don't want. You're invading Russia with forces that we gave you money to create. You can't, we helped them create Frankenstein's monster. Now Frankenstein's monster's got off the reservation and starts eating the people he's not supposed to eat. We're to blame. We created Frankenstein's monster. And right now we're telling them to get Frankenstein's monster under control, or we're going to kill Frankenstein and his monster.
So one last question before I let you go. So we saw right after the election, which obviously Putin was going to win and won, the attacks ramped up tremendously. So are we going to see another increase in retaliation for this act of terrorism, or do you think that will be dealt with aside and they'll continue with what they have planned? Because to me, it looks like we're opening up the front much wider to prepare for something on the ground. They were opening up air defenses in Kiev and Lvov. So what are your thoughts on the current status of the SMO?
I think we're going to see the SMO transition into war in the not too distant future. I think it's already, from a certain standpoint, the gloves have come off. You take a look at the targeting that the Russians have been doing recently, taking out decision-making centers, taking out not just doing limited damage. The Russians have always done. It's basically they've been going down into the basement and hitting the breaker switch and running out. And you go, damn it, I got to go downstairs and turn on the breaker switch. That's a pain.
Exactly.
But you can turn on the breaker switch. You could always repair it.
It's just a hassle, yeah.
Yeah, but what the Russians just is they came out and they took out the entire thing. They ripped out, the gas meter, all that thing. And you're going downstairs going, well, there ain't no breaker switch. There ain't nothing. It's not there. Welcome to the new reality.
Yeah.
Russia is shutting down. Kharkov is shut down. And they're going to be shutting down other cities, other centers. They're targeting underground gas storage. They're targeting the gas distribution. Ukraine is going to cease to function as a nation state. They're starting to take out decision-making centers. I would imagine in the not too distant future, when they can establish the linkage with Ukraine, they're going to start killing very senior Ukrainians. But more importantly, Russia's made a strategic decision. Vladimir Putin and Shoigu and Gerasimov just had a meeting where they announced the creation of the Dnieper River Flotilla.
Yep.
Why? Russia doesn't control the Dnieper River. Why would they make a flotilla? They plan on controlling the Dnieper River soon. When? Yep. This summer. And why would they need to control the Dnieper River? Because that's going to be a major part of the new line of contact. I think you're going to see the Ukrainians, and you already hear talk about it. They've run out of men. They don't have enough men. It's verging on the total collapse. So they have no choice but to withdraw behind the Dnieper River line and take those forces that would otherwise have to man that line fully and redistribute them into Kharkov and into Odessa. So Russia is going to take control of the Dnieper River with their flotilla, and they have dedicated forces for that, a division linked to the flotilla and several independent brigades, but also 2 new combined arms armies that are going to be involved in major offensive operations, I believe, to take Kharkov and take Odessa. This is war. Russia's basically saying, we're done playing games. We are eliminating you. and we will continue to eliminate you until you no longer exist. I think the decision is made that it's shut out the lights, the party's over for Ukraine. And we're waiting for Russia to make that political decision, but Russia doesn't do things knee-jerk reaction. Before Putin, just to give you an example of why I say this, everybody in January of 2022 was saying Russia's going to invade. Russia's going to invade. Remember the Americans? They're invading tomorrow. I'm like, no, they're not. I'm not saying they're not going to invade, but they ain't invading tomorrow. Well, how can you say that? They're moving troops around. I said, because Russia, there's things that have to happen first. Let me tell you what has to happen first. First, the LNR, the Lugansk and Donetsk have to do a referendum where they declare independence. Why do they have to do that? Well, you see, for Russia to move into Ukraine, they either have to declare war or there has to be a collective self-defense. But they can't have collective self-defense unless they have entities that they are collectively self-defending with. And so they have to declare independence. Now, the next thing that has to happen is then they have to request the Russians to recognize their independence and then to seek to join together in a collective security. This requires a request to Parliament. Parliament has to meet and speak, and then the president has to receive it and go back to Parliament and get it, and then it can happen. When that happens, Russia will move into Ukraine. But until that happens, don't tell me it's happening tomorrow, because this is a minimum of 3 days, maybe 5 day, maybe a week-long event. When it starts to happen, we can say, I'm comfortable that the invasion is taking place after that. People are like, no, it happened exactly how I said, because that's how Russia works. Russia is a nation of systemic laws, systemic, procedures. And so if for Putin to say, I'm going to make the transition from SMO to war, I'm going to do this, the first thing that has to happen is he has to have the means available to back up his words. And so the Russian military right now is creating those means. Those means will be available sometime in the June, July timeframe. And at that point in time, maybe sooner, depending on how fast, because I'm not in the Russian general staff, I don't know their timelines. But when they have the military means capable, Putin will come out and say, and now we're transitioning from the SMO to war. Zelensky's going to die. Budanov's going to die. They're all going to die. And we're just going to take the whole thing over. We're done with you. And I think that's the future going forward. I think this, especially this attack, has cemented Ukraine's future. As Burtnikov said, everything's ahead of us. It's going to be ugly.
Everything's ahead of us, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, Scott, tell our listeners where they can find you and what you're up to as of late. ScottRitterExtra.com. You go there. That's where my Substack is. I'm hopefully publishing a piece today on this terrorist attack. All my podcasts that I do are on there, the ones that I'm responsible for, and the ones like this. If you provide me the link, I will put it out there. It's just a one-stop shop. There's no paywall, but if you want to donate, as always, there are ways that can happen too. Well, thank you, Scott. And please, guys, visit the new website at ddgeopolitics.com. There are ways to donate, merchandise to buy, and up-to-date Substacks and YouTube videos. Thank you all, and we will see you this weekend with Dr. Syed Marandi of Iran. Thank you very much, Scott. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.